Parkland Hospital on November 22nd, 1963, when President Kennedy was brought there. And so I'm going to turn it over to the good doctor. And
you said I can carry this microphone?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And if let me see if it's too loud. Is that too loud?
Okay.
Get this thing. If it's too loud, I can adjust it back there.
Okay. I'll just give it a test. Is that okay in the back of the room? Okay. What I'm going to kind of divide this talk into is what happened as I saw it, sort of a worm's eye view in the emergency room at Parkland Hospital on 2 days. The first day, November the 22nd, 1963, when President Kennedy was brought in, and then a day and a half or 2 days later, on Sunday, that was on Friday, that President Kennedy was brought into the Parkland emergency room. And on Sunday, they brought in his alleged assassin, Harvey Oswald, who had been shot by Jack Ruby when being transferred from the police jail to the county jail. So that was what happened on those 2 days, and I'm going to kind of divide my talk into what happened as we saw it there at Parkland on those 2 days. On the 22nd, we knew that President Kennedy, of course, was coming into town. In fact, they had a big picture of him in one of the, at that time, 2 papers were published in Dallas. And there was a big picture of President Kennedy in one of those papers, and he was being accused of being a traitor, said wanted for treason. So this was kind of the atmosphere that he came into Dallas with. At that time, it was referred to later as the City of Hate. So it was kind of a charged atmosphere that President Kennedy came into. And in fact, some people had even advised him in Washington that he should not come down to Texas. But he insisted on coming because he thought that his, election chances need to be shored up by making that visit. So that's what they did. Well, on the day that assassination occurred, I was in Parkland Hospital in the operating room, and I was showing a movie about how to repair a hiatus hernia to some of the senior surgery residents. And that was right at noon on that day of the 22nd. And as I was in the midst of showing that movie, I heard a little tap on the conference room door where we were showing the movie. And so I went to the door and looked out, and one of our senior surgery residents was standing outside the door. And so he said, Dr. Mack, would you mind stepping out here? I need to tell you something. And so I went in and shut off the projector and stepped back out. And Dr. Crenshaw, the resident who had tapped on the door, said they just called the emergency room from the police department downtown and said that President Kennedy has been shot during his motorcade, and they're bringing him into Parkland now, and they want all of the surgical faculty to come down to the emergency room immediately. So with that, Dr. Crenshaw and I got on the elevator there on the second floor of Parkland and rode down 2 floors to the emergency room, which was just below the operating room. And as we rode down the elevator, we were trying to cheer each other up, and I said, well, Chuck, Dr. Crenshaw was called Chuck, and he said, I wonder, how that happened. And I said, well, a lot of times we get messages that they're bringing something into Parkland, and it's terrible, but then when the actual fact is seen, it turns out it's not that bad. So let's hope maybe that's the case here, that it's not as bad as they said it was. With that, the elevator door came open into the emergency room, and we entered into an area that was probably about 1/3 the size of this area here that we call the pit. And around that pit area in the emergency room were a lot of patient cubicles. This was, needless to say, was and still is a very active emergency room at Parkland Hospital. And as we stepped out of the elevator, we saw that in that big area we call the pit, it was filled with people, men in business suits, jammed shoulder to shoulder. And I thought, I've never seen any kind of crowd like that. in the emergency room. And as Dr. Crenshaw and I stood there and looked at that, the crowd parted sort of spontaneously and made a little corridor down to a hallway that extended out from that pit area. And on each side of that hallway, there were 2 emergency operating rooms, 2 on each side. Emergency operating room 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this crowd, when they parted, allowed us to see that hallway. And sitting there next to trauma room 1 in the hallway was Mrs. Kennedy in her bloody clothing. So I knew immediately that, well, this is just as bad as it had been said to be. At the same time I thought about that, it occurred to me that it being there at noon, and everybody often left the hospital to go out and get a hamburger somewhere along Harry Hines to avoid the Parkland food. So I thought to myself, I may be the only surgical faculty here. I knew that my chief of surgery, Dr. Shires, was at a meeting in Galveston. And the only other 2 associates I had at that time, the faculty was only 4 people. Now we have 56 people on the surgical faculty at Parkland. I will probably be the only person here. I was 2 days past my 34th birthday and still very wet behind the ears. And I really had to almost make myself, force myself to keep walking toward Mrs. Kennedy. And I walked by her, pushed the door to trauma room 1 open, and was greeted by a terrible sight of President Kennedy lying on his back with a light shining down on his very bloody head. At the same time I saw that horrific sight, I was gratified to see that I was not by myself, that my 2 associates, Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter, had just preceded me into the room. And so as I walked on into the room and walked by the cart where the president was lying, Dr. Perry was over on the other side of the president, and he leaned across the cart and handed me a surgical retractor. And he said, "Bob, we're about to explore a wound in his neck that was right here, a small hole just above his collarbone and just next to his windpipe. And we're worried that this may have injured his carotid artery, which carries blood to the brain. And so we're going to look at that and see what's going on." The president was unconscious and completely unaware of what was going on. And so I went and stood at the head of the cart where the president was lying and took the retractor in preparation to lean over and place it in the exploratory incision that Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter were about to make in the neck near this wound. And as I walked around the head of the gurney, the cart the president was lying on, I said, "My God, have you seen the back of his head? It's gone on the right side." And they said, "No, we haven't seen that because we just walked in here just ahead of you and saw only this wound here." And I said, "Well, the whole right side of his head on the back was blown out. And I could actually look down inside his skull cavity and see that the back half of his right cerebral hemisphere was gone. And just as I saw that, the right half of his cerebellum slowly fell out of this hole in the back of his head." I'm giving that grim description of it to give you an idea that this was obviously a fatal wound. There's no way that he could have survived that. Some people often ask, well, nowadays with modern therapy and whatnot, might he have survived? There's no way that wound would have not been fatal, well, either now or then or ever. So that's where we were. And they had already started making this incision here. And so they went ahead and hastily finished that. And just as they did, Dr. Kemp Clark, who was our professor of neurosurgery at Parkland at that time, had walked in to trauma room 1 and was standing to one side of the cart where the president was, watching the electrocardiographic monitor that had been attached to the president's chest. And when he came in, he was, despite that massive wound, he had good cardiac activity on the electrocardiogram and was even making attempts to breathe. And so Dr. Clark was looking at that monitor, and about 4 or 5 minutes after we got into the room and Dr. Clark had come into the room, he saw that the monitor had straight line. And so he said to Dr. Perry, who was doing this exploration on the president's neck, he said, "Mac, you can stop now because he's gone." Those are his exact words. And with that, everybody sort of began to surge out of the room. In Trauma Room 1, despite trying to keep everybody out, it had become packed with people as we were working on the president. But now they began to surge out of the room, and in doing that, they pushed the cart the president was lying on against the wall of Trauma Room 1, and Dr. Baxter and I got trapped between the cart and the wall. So we had to stand there while the rest of the crowd left the room. And then, after the crowd had emptied out, we pushed the cart away from us and began to prepare to walk around the end of it so we could leave, Dr. Baxter and I. But just as we did that, before we could leave, the door to Trauma Room 1 came open again, and a priest came in. And so we would have had to push him out of the way in order to get out of the room, and so we just again froze against the wall and found ourselves feeling inappropriately like we shouldn't be there, but we couldn't get out. So we had to stand there and listen to Father Huber, we later found out was the priest's name, administer the last rites to the president. He uncovered the president's face. A sheet had been pulled over his face, and leaned over into his left ear, and I couldn't hear but the very first phrase that he said. He said, "If thou livest," emphasizing the if, and then he completed what he was saying, and I couldn't hear anything else that he said. But he quickly administered the last rites, starting out by anointing the president's forehead. And then when he finished, he was preparing to leave, and the door came open to Trauma Room 1 again, and Mrs. Kennedy, who had, as I said, been sitting in a chair outside the room, came in and stood next to Father Huber and across from Dr. Baxter and me, and I couldn't hear what she said because she spoke in such a quiet, low voice. But from the context of Father Huber's answer to the question she asked him, I assumed that she asked Father Huber if President Kennedy had received the last rites. And Father Huber said, "Yes, I've given him conditional absolution." Well, Mrs. Kennedy didn't say anything, but she grimaced when she heard that word conditional. But she stood there for a moment and then exchanged a ring from her finger onto the president's finger and a ring from his finger onto hers. And she stood there for just another few moments without saying anything. She was perfectly contained. Obviously, she appeared very shocked, but unlike the recent movie Parkland that shows her being hysterical and throwing her body over the president's body, that didn't happen. She was very much in control of herself. And she stood there, as I said, for a few moments, and then walked slowly down to the end of the cart where the president's bare right foot was sticking out from underneath the sheet that he was covered with. She stood by his bare right foot for a moment and then leaned over and kissed his foot and walked out of the room. And so then with that, Dr. Baxter and I quickly left and went back up to the operating room on the second floor of Parkland and sat down and sort of looked at one another as if, was this a bad dream or what was this that happened that we just, seen? And as we sat there in the nurses' station in the operating room at Parkland, we were joined by Dr. Rose, who was our pathologist there, who was a forensic pathologist who did postmortem exams on murder victims and that sort of thing at Parkland. And he came up from his office, which was also on the bottom floor of Parkland near the emergency room, and sat down with us and told us what his experience had just been. He was sitting in his office and looking out through a window onto a long corridor that led out to the exit of Parkland. And as he sat there, he saw this little procession of people coming down that hallway, and it was the president, who has now been placed in a coffin that had been brought out from O'Neill Funeral Home, and he had been lifted into the coffin and placed in that while he was still in Trauma Room 1. And the coffin was being carried out toward an ambulance that was parked at the back of that back entrance of Parkland. And walking in front of the ambulance were two Secret Service men. One of them was carrying a Thompson submachine gun. And then on the left side of the cart, walking along, was Mrs. Kennedy. And on the other side of the cart were several of President Kennedy's friends, Kenny O'Donnell and some of the others who had flown down from Washington with him to make that visit to Dallas. And so as they went along, and Dr. Rose saw them, he said with a great deal of trepidation, I got up and told them, I walked out into the hall and asked them to stop, that I was required by law to tell them something. And so they dutifully stopped and listened to him. And he said, I need to tell you that it's a Texas law that any murder that's committed in the state, the murder victim must undergo a postmortem exam here. Well, Dr. Rose said they took that in, didn't say anything. Well, one of the Secret Service men, the one who was unencumbered by the Thompson submachine gun, walked over to Dr. Rose, who was rather small, and the Secret Service man was rather large, put his hands underneath his armpits, lifted him up off the ground, and placed him over against the wall of the corridor, and shook his finger in his face, and they turned and walked out of the hospital and put President Kennedy into the ambulance and carried him back to Love Field and to Air Force One, where they then flew back to Washington. They had no intention of leaving him here. And so Dr. Rose told us about that rather difficult experience that he had. So basically that's what happened on the 22nd that we saw at Parkland. Then on Saturday, nothing happened much, and a lot of activity talking about this on television and the radio and whatnot, just nonstop on those sources of information about what had happened. And then on Sunday, the third day after the assassination of President Kennedy, my wife and two small children and I had been to church, and we just come back, and they were upstairs getting ready to go out to lunch, and I was down in the living room, and I thought, well, while they're upstairs getting ready to go out, I'll turn the television on and see what's happening, what news there is now. Well, as it happened, when I turned the television set on in my living room, before the picture formed, I heard a voice saying very excitedly, "He's been shot, he's been shot." And I thought, my, what now? And then the picture formed, and Ruby has just shot Oswald as he's being transferred from the police jail to the county jail. And Oswald is just slumped to the floor. And so I got up, walked to the foot of my stairway at home, called up to my wife, and I said, I'm going to have to miss lunch because they've just shot just shot Oswald, and I need to go to Parkland to see what I can do to help. So my wife called down and she said, who is Oswald? And I said, he's the man they say shot President Kennedy. Oh, she said, well, we'll see you later. And so I, with that, went and got in my car and drove out quickly to Parkland. And on my way there, I met my chief of surgery, Dr. Shires, who had returned from his meeting in Galveston, where he had been on the day the president was shot. And we stopped each other and let each other know that we had just heard what had happened at Parkland. And he turned his car around, and we both sped out to Parkland and parked behind the emergency room, which you could do at that time, but can't now, and went into the emergency room. And Doris Nelson, the nurse on charge who had also been in charge when the president was shot. She knew who we were looking for, and she said, he's in there. That is to say, he was in trauma room 2 across the hall from where the president had been treated on that Friday. Well, Dr. Shires and I looked into that room and saw that it was a beehive of activity. Nurses, residents, interns were working on Oswald, pumping blood into him, getting him ready to go up to the operating room and have his wounds explored. What had happened to him, unfortunately, he had a wound that was fatal that might not have been fatal had he not turned in the way he did when he saw Ruby approaching him with a pistol. Had he not turned, the bullet might have gone through his abdomen from the front and out the back and given him some serious wounds but not have killed him. As it was, though, he turned his left side to the pistol so that the bullet went in high on his left side and went across the back of his abdomen and injured both his aorta and his vena cava, the 2 major blood vessels in the body. Usually you bleed out from that immediately. However, as luck would have it, that didn't happen with Oswald. So we got him up to the operating room and explored his abdomen. And Dr. Shires, who was the surgeon of record, and Dr. Perry and Dr. Jones, who was subsequently the chief of surgery at Baylor, is just now retiring, in fact, and I formed the operating team exploring Oswald. And Dr. Shires was almost able to get down to the injury of these major vessels and get clamps on them, but just as he did that, the anesthesiologist said that he's arrested. And so Dr. Perry and I dropped out, opened his chest, and massaged his heart, and initially it looked like that his heart was going to come back, but then it stopped again, and it did that 2 or 3 times over a period of about 20 or 25 minutes that we worked on it and massaged it, and then it became apparent that he could not be resuscitated, and so he was pronounced dead. And with that, we went back out to the nurses' station, where the detective who had been handcuffed to Oswald when he was shot was sitting out waiting to hear what happened. And so we told him what had transpired in the operating room. And he said, well, you know, as soon as he was shot and fell to the floor there in the police station, I got down over his body and put my face down in his. And he had his eyes closed, and I said, son, you're hurt real bad. Would you like to say anything to me now about what's been happening? And he said, Oswald, with that, opened his eyes real wide, looked up at the detective for a long few moments, and then shook his head like that, real wide from side to side. The detective said, I will believe until the day I die, and incidentally, that detective is still alive in Dallas at the age of 91. I will believe until the day I die that he was thinking about saying something critical about what had happened and what was behind what happened. But then he thought better of doing that, closed his eyes, and then, of course, never opened them again. And so that's what happened with Oswald on the day that he was brought in, 2 days after the president was brought in. And then with that, of course, everybody began to wonder what really had happened. Was there a conspiracy that is just one shooter, Oswald, or was there not a conspiracy, just one shooter, Oswald, or was there a conspiracy, and where did that conspiracy arrive from? Well, the Warren Commission was set up to examine what happened, and they studied all of the events surrounding the assassination at that time, and came to the conclusion that there was no conspiracy, that Oswald was just a kind of, as he was referred to then, a lone nut who had decided to come down and shoot the president. However, about 3/4 at least of the American public didn't buy that story that the Warren Commission came up with. And there was so much discontent with it that continued to be expressed all over, that in 1976 to 1979, the House Special Select Committee on Assassinations restudied this and spent 3 years going through all of the details of what had happened on that day of the assassination. And they came to the conclusion, unlike the original Warren Commission, that there had been a conspiracy. Although, oddly enough, they said that we will not be able to release the details of that conspiracy for 50 years, in other words, until 2029. Well, needless to say, everybody wondered, why is that? That just added more mystery to what had happened. So basically, that's the story that we were in contact with at Parkland on those 2 days, Friday, November the 22nd, and then Sunday, November the 24th. I think I will now stop and see if anybody has some questions about any of this. And I'll do my best to answer them or tell you that I can't answer them. Yes, sir.
Where exactly is Parkland?
Where's what?
Where is Parkland?
Where is Parkland? Well, it's in Dallas, near downtown Dallas. Very large hospital now. When I came there in 1957 to start my residency, Parkland was much smaller, and there were 3 buildings on the campus of the medical school associated with it, Southwestern Medical School. Now, there are 99 buildings. Parkland is about 3 times bigger than it was then, and so that's how it's grown during that time. And it's, I think, a very prominent hospital and medical school that we're very proud to have here in this vicinity. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Is the treatment of a president any different than the treatment of a normal person by the surgical staff?
That's a good question. In fact, we asked the Secret Service men who were accompanying the president there when he was brought in, we said, why did you happen to choose Parkland rather than one of the private hospitals like Baylor Hospital or Methodist Hospital, since they were, you know, nicer than Parkland, which is a big charity hospital. And they said, well, we routinely, whenever we plan a trip, think about maybe something like this happening. And if it did, where would we take the president? And what we do is identify whether there is a medical school there and where is the hospital that's attached to the medical school. Because there we feel like the president will get much better treatment. Otherwise, when he was brought into Parkland and put into Trauma Room 1 to be treated, that was just, you know, like anybody else who had undergone a gunshot wound like that, and he was treated just the same. No different from anybody else. Unfortunately, there was no treatment for what he had. So, any other questions? Well, it's still a question as to what happened. I've put a few books up here that you might want to just look at the covers of them. There have been more than 3,200 books written about various aspects of the assassination. One particularly interesting book is a book by Douglas called JFK and the Unspeakable. They concluded that the conspiracy that was officially declared to be a conspiracy in that congressional investigation in 1976 to 79, that the conspiracy to kill the president had arisen from the highest levels of the government. That is, from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and from the CIA. Now, you might say, well, why was that? Well, President Kennedy, according to this book, and you take it for, you know, what it's worth, but I think it's reasonably well documented and intriguing. On 3 occasions, President Kennedy thwarted the desire at that time, and then this is principally under the aegis of General Curtis LeMay, who was the general on the Joint Chiefs of Staff from the Air Force. And at that time, in the very severe Cold War days, there was talk about making a first nuclear strike on the Russians to hit them before they hit us. And General LeMay was very strongly in favor of doing that. And on 3 different occasions, they thought they had excuse to mount a first nuclear strike. The Joint Chiefs of Staff did, and elements of the CIA. The first of these was when the Berlin Wall, the Bay of Pigs occurred right after the president was inaugurated. He was greeted with a fait accompli that they invaded Cuba. And he was, they thought, was supposed to aid that investigation, that invasion of Cuba, by providing air cover to the invading forces. He refused to do that. And so that invasion of Cuba failed. That was the first thing that sort of gave him a black eye, so to speak, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The second thing that occurred was when the Berlin Wall went up in August of 1961, again, under the aegis of General LeMay and the other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They thought that this would give them an adequate excuse to make a first nuclear strike against the Russians. But again, President Kennedy got on the back line, which had just been set up, with Premier Khrushchev in Russia. And they talked this down and sort of poured oil on the water and took away any possible chance of mounting a strike against Russia at that time by our forces. The third and final time occurred in a much more critical time. In October of 1962, the Russians began to put missiles into Cuba, and our planes observed them. And at that time, LeMay particularly wanted to cause them to make a first nuclear strike against Cuba and against the Russians. However, again, Khrushchev was consulted by President Kennedy, and they made an agreement that if the Russians would take the missiles out of Cuba, that we would take our missiles pointed at Russia that were in Turkey. And so they did that. And again, on this third occasion, took away any excuse for making a nuclear strike against the Russians. Well, this discommoded particularly the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and particularly General Curtis LeMay. And that's talked about in this book here, JFK and the Unspeakable. Now, whether that really happened or not, I don't know. That's an apocryphal story. But I think it's not unlikely that something like that did happen in those early Cold War days. So with that background against not doing what they think he should have done, the thought was that someone said we need to get rid of him. That is, that was noised about maybe by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA, and so they set up the assassination that occurred here. And as it later turns out, there was evidence that Oswald, the assassin, was in all probability a low-level CIA agent. So that's where it was left. But that has still, of course, never been confirmed and may never be confirmed about what was the source of the conspiracy that led to the death of President Kennedy. So those are all very iffy sort of things that I just told you about. Yes, sir.
Do you travel anywhere or tell your experience or of anything that...
No, I try to keep a low profile as much as I can. So, yes, sir.
What's your opinion on the motives of the shooter? Like why they did it?
Well, why they did it was because they thought he was maybe thwarting, as I said, on these 3 occasions, and maybe other occasions, their ability to make a nuclear strike against the Russians before they hit us. Now, whether that's really what happened, we don't know. We may never know. But the thought was, when they set up this congressional investigation of the shooting in 1976 through 1979, they came up with the conclusion that in all probability there was a conspiracy that led to the shooting of the president, and this was not just some lone crazy guy who decided one day to come downtown and shoot the president. that there was a conspiracy. But the nature of the conspiracy, I don't think that's ever been established, but there was a conspiracy. So, yes, sir.
Were there more than one shooter, or was it just Oswald?
That's a good question. I think there well may have been another shooter. The wounds that he had one wound in his back that came out his neck. That was a wound that they were beginning to explore. Then the bullet that hit him and blew out the back of his head almost certainly came from a second shooter who was behind the picket fence in front of the oncoming motorcade. And if any of you have seen maybe the Zapruder film, you know, there's a man who filmed all of that, Mr. Zapruder, who was a businessman in Dallas who happened to be down on the grassy knoll that day with his camera, and he filmed the entire assassination. And if you see that film, which perhaps some of you have, I've seen it several times, the first thing you see is the motorcade making a turn off of Houston Street onto Elm Street and beginning to drive down toward the triple underpass there in Dallas. And as they make that turn and the motorcade slows down, the president looks fine. He's sitting up in the back seat of the limousine. And then just as you see that, he raises both hands to his neck as if something has just happened, like that bullet that came in the back and came out his neck. That's when that first shot, I think, was fired. Then the motorcade moves slowly on down toward the triple underpass and disappears for a few seconds behind a metal sign on the edge of Elm Street just in front of the triple underpass. And as he comes out from behind that sign that's obscuring what's happening for a few minutes, as they come out from behind that sign, Mrs. Kennedy has realized that something has happened to the president, and she's leaning over to him as if to ask him what's wrong. And he still has his hands up to his neck. And just as that happens, just as she leans over to him, and you see this on the Zapruder film, all of a sudden his head literally explodes, and he's thrown violently backward and to the left. And almost undoubtedly, that second bullet came from a shooter behind the picket fence. But there's still a lot of argument about just what happened. But from what I've seen of that Zapruder film on several occasions, I think that's what happened. So there was another shooter. Yes, sir.
Did you not have to operate on, I think it was Governor Collins that also got shot?
Yes, he was there, and he was in the trauma room just across the hall from where President Kennedy was being treated in Trauma Room 1. Yes, and he was being operated on. He had a wound in his chest, and there's some people have said, was that the same bullet that hit the president in the back and came out and then hit him in the chest? We don't know. There's a lot of argument about that. But he had quite a serious wound in his chest, and so he was being taken care of by our professor, Dr. Shaw, our professor of thoracic surgery, and Dr. Red Duke, who was one of our senior surgery residents. And some of you may have seen him on television on a number of occasions. He's a professor down at the medical school in Houston, Dr. Duke is. So they were taking care of the governor. Needless to say, the governor got a little bit short shift since the president was taking up all of the attention of most of the people there in the emergency room. But he survived and was in the hospital at Parkland there for a couple of 3 weeks before he was able to leave the hospital. Yes, sir.
Have you heard about the conspiracy while President Kennedy was being operated on? His limousine that had all the evidence was cleaned out, and that the orders were not given?
That's right. They cleaned it up, they just polished it up and got rid of all the blood stains and everything else. So, certainly strange to allow a crime scene to be quickly cleaned up like that. A lot of oddball things, and again, the congressional investigation concluded that there was a conspiracy. We just don't know the nature of the conspiracy yet and may never know it. There was a conspiracy that led to the assassination of President Lincoln. And to this day, we don't know who was the mastermind of that conspiracy. I think it was the Secretary of War, but that's just a personal opinion. But there was a conspiracy with Lincoln as well as with Kennedy. Yes, sir.
Do you believe anything will be released in, I think you said.
2029? I don't know. They said that they would release, the full details of that congressional investigation, but whether they will or not, I won't be around, to know about it. And I suspect that we may never get the full story, just like we've not got the full story about President Lincoln. Yes, sir.
Do you believe that the U.S. government was involved in the assassination?
Of the president? Yes, I do. Maybe not the whole government, but like I say, elements of the CIA and elements of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And this book makes the point that perhaps that was not President, but General LeMay, who was the Air Force general on the Joint Chiefs of Staff at that time. And he was very much wanting to make a first nuclear strike on the Russians back in the early 60s. Thank God Kennedy prevented that, or none of us would maybe be sitting here or standing here. That would have been a terrible thing that might have happened. So, okay.
Doctor, would you say like the exit wound or the wound that you were at the head of the table, where the cerebellum is, would you say that was an exit wound?
I say that was an exit wound. Characteristically, an exit wound, makes a large blast that blows out a big hole, whereas an entrance wound is just about the size of the bullet. Now, always when I discuss that, people say, well, did you see an entrance wound? We did not. We were ushered out of that room as quickly as possible once the president was declared dead, so we didn't get a chance to go over him. His head was bloody. He had a lot of hair, and I think probably the bullet, as it looked like it hit him on the Zapruder film, hit somewhere here about the hairline from being fired from the picket fence in front of him, and then blew out this large hole in the back of his head that was probably at least 5 inches in diameter. So that's, I think, the nature of the second bullet that hit him. The first bullet came from probably one of the buildings nearby, went in his back and came out his neck. We thought this was an entrance wound in his neck, but later we found out about this wound in his back and assumed that it was an exit wound in the neck, not an entrance wound. So, yes,
The president wasn't in great health, and did he wear
a brace?
a brace?
Yes, he did.
He
He had a brace on. Yeah, and had an ace bandage wrapped around his right thigh. I don't know what that was, but in any event, he had a bad back, as you know.
So does that keep him sitting up, maybe?
Yes, and somebody has made the point that had he not been held up in the position that he was in, perhaps he wouldn't have been wounded fatally as he was. I don't really believe that. I think they would have got him one way or the other, as they did, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Do you have any idea what size of round was used to shoot him?
No, I don't. I think it probably was a pretty high-powered rifle that hit him and blew out that wound in his head. I don't think that was necessarily so from this wound in his back that came out his neck. That could have been any caliber of bullet. But there was a pretty big bullet that blew out the back of his head like that.
How large was the hole that was on his neck coming out from?
How long was it?
How large was it?
Oh, it was the end of my finger. Just a little hole right here just above the collarbone and just next to the windpipe. And that's what they were first exploring. And then when I got back and looked at the back of his head, I said, my God, have you seen this hole in the back of his head? And they said, no, we hadn't seen that because they had just walked in right before I did to trauma room 1.
Doctor, did any government official ever contact you after your examination?
Oh, yes, I was, I was on the, testified to the Warren Commission. and like everybody else. So we got our, statements made that way. They didn't spend a lot of time. I was interviewed by Arlen Specter, who, later ran for president. And he was just kind of matter of fact, over about a 25 or 30-minute interview there in the administrator's office at Parkland. That was my contact with the Warren Commission.
Have you
Yeah.
been involved in anything since with the anniversary?
Was what now?
Have you been involved in anything since his death with
No.
interviews or documentaries?
No, I have given this talk ad nauseum, over the years a good many times. I feel like I'm hearing an echo in my head, but I haven't been involved in any of the, things that they had just recently.
Have you ever attended a conspiracy theory conference?
Yeah, yeah. So,
Have you ever been told to not say anything?
no, that question is often asked, and nobody has ever, the only thing I know about that, Dr. Perry, right after the shooting occurred, Dr. Perry and Dr. Clark went up to an auditorium at Parkland right after the shooting and met with a whole room full of newsmen. And so Dr. Perry described the wounds and said that, he thought that this wound here, that we initially thought it was an entrance wound, but then later we heard that there was a bullet wound in the back. We heard that from the pathologist in Washington the next day. So when Dr. Perry left that interview session there on the day of the assassination, he was standing outside in the hall, and a man came up to him with a Secret Service emblem in his lapel, and he said to Dr. Perry, Dr. Perry, I'd like to suggest to you that you never, ever again say that this was an entrance wound, if you know what's good for you. So that's the only kind of threatening thing I heard in relation to Dr. Perry. So there's a lot we don't know about it, and probably a lot we never will know. Okay? Yes?
Given that you said he had trouble with General May, and you also said that you believe the rifle was a high-powered rifle, and the accuracy of the shot hitting him in the head, do you think that the shot could have been from somebody in the military?
Oh, that thought has been raised. In fact, some people have even said that the guy driving the president's limousine turned around and shot him. I think that's absurd. But it could have come from who knows where, really. We don't really know. I think, it probably came, certainly the second shot came from the grassy knoll, the picket fence. The first shot probably, underlined probably, but we don't know, came from one of the buildings around the motorcade. But we don't know. We don't really have a good description of that. So, yes.
After Oswald was shot, did the people that operate on him kind of treat him differently, or were you obligated to treat him as a normal patient?
Well, that's a good question, too. And I didn't say what happened. When we explored him, he died on the table. And Dr. Perry and I dropped out and massaged his heart for, probably 20 or 25 minutes and thought it was going to come back at first. But then it got flabbier and flabbier, and so he was pronounced dead. So we didn't have any contact with him after that. Certainly had he survived, we would have treated him just like anybody else with a bullet wound. So, okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
I wanted to give you a hat and tell you thank you so much for coming.
Well,
and you can
thank
be an honorary Fort Worth Christian Cardinal now.
Wonderful.
You gotta do the lawn mowing cap for the summer.
Yeah, okay.
Or just lounging around that. That looks good. That looks good. That looks good.
Good. Yes, sir.
What's in the baggies?
Oh. You see this bloodstained shirt? That's the shirt I had on when I was helping take care of President Kennedy. My entire suit was soaked in blood, And the next day, my wife took it to the cleaners. And he knew what it was, and he said, "Are you going to have this cleaned?" And she said, "My husband only has one other suit." And so they cleaned the suit, but had the presence of mind to keep the shirt that I was wearing back. And so that's President Kennedy's blood there on that shirt tail. And then that's just a newspaper there.